Universities have lost the trust of the American people, and that's not a problem with the American people. That's a problem with universities. Universities have lost their sense of what they're supposed to be doing, what their mission is. I think what their mission is getting at the truth of things across the range of disciplines, across the arts and sciences and in the professional field. The business is not ideology. It's not social justice. It's not training people to work at Goldman Sachs. The mission of the university is to try to figure out what's true.
Brother Robbie and I are calling for the reaffirmation of the Socratic ideal of serious argument across the board. But it has always failed, and it probably always will fail. We just have to look at the nature of the failure now. The nature of the failure now is just so deep. There's a moral and spiritual bankruptcy in so many of these universities, and it needs to be recast.
If we wrap our emotions too tightly around our convictions, and it is a perennial temptation to do that, we become dogmatists. We become ideologues. We refuse to listen to somebody else's point of view, and we want a point of view that challenges the convictions that we've emotionally so invested in to be suppressed, to be shut down. And then that's the end of truth-seeking. We become tribalists, pure, simple tribalists. And we don't want to be there. Don't be a tribalist.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to The Glenn Show. This is Glenn Loury. I'm with my conversation partner and co-host, John McWhorter. I teach at Brown University. John teaches at Columbia University, and he writes for the New York Times. We're joined this week by Robert George, who is McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton University, where he directs the James Madison Program for the Study of American Ideals and Institutions, and Cornel West, who is Dietrich Bonhoeffer Professor of Philosophy and Christian Practice at the Union Theological Seminary, and is a former presidential candidate in the last cycle. Some of you will know. Robbie and Cornel are co-authors of a small book, which is in effect, transcript of a series of conversations that they undertook in New York City over the years 2022 and 2023, called Truth Matters: A Dialogue on Fruitful Disagreement in an Age of Division. Provocative and wide-ranging conversations, the copy here I'm looking at tells us, recorded in New York City in 3 sessions during the fall of 2023 and the spring of 2024, where in prompting and directing the discussion, emphasis was placed on relating current issues to deeper questions of knowledge, faith, and the search for truth and common ground. It goes on. So, welcome, Robbie. Welcome, Cornel. And hey there, John.
Hey, Glenn. Hey, folks.
We are living in interesting times. The universities are under attack, are they not? The citadels of the production of knowledge and the preservation of our civilization seem to be in the crosshairs, politically speaking. And if truth ever mattered, it certainly matters now. And the sources of our production of our insights into the truth seem to be under attack. I wonder what you guys have to say about that, Robbie.
Well, first, Glenn, thanks so much for being on. I'm an avid listener to you and John, so it's really great to be actually conversing with you. And of course, it's always just such a joy to be with my dear brother, Cornel. And thanks so much for calling attention to our book. We have a little message we're trying to send. We have gospel we're trying to preach, and we're grateful to you for helping us to get the word out. Well, universities are in a crisis, but look, they've been in crisis for a long time. They were in a crisis before the Trump administration or the latest round of cancellations of funding, government funding for university programs at Columbia and Princeton and other places. And it's really a crisis about the mission of the university. Universities have lost the trust of the American people. There's absolutely no question about that. And that's not a problem with the American people. That's a problem with universities. Universities have lost their sense of what they're supposed to be doing, what their mission is. Now, I think what their mission is getting at the truth of things across the range of disciplines, across the arts and sciences and in the professional field, trying to get at the truth of things. The business is not ideology. It's not social justice. It's not training people to work at Goldman Sachs. You know, all of those things have a legitimate role on a university campus, but they are not the mission of the university. The mission of the university is to try to figure out what's true, try to figure out what is the case and what's not the case, again, across the range of disciplines. It's about the pursuit of knowledge. If we were doing our jobs correctly in universities, we'd be forming the young women and men who are entrusted to our charge to be determined truth seekers themselves and courageous truth speakers. Now, let's ask ourselves, have we been doing that? Have universities been doing that for the past 25, 30 years? No way. So we need reform. Now, the kinds of government intrusions you're now seeing into universities, especially those that really do impinge on academic freedom, are entirely out of line. But let's be honest, those same fundamental values, that same principle of academic freedom, has been under assault from within universities for a long time. And there's something just smellily hypocritical about all of a sudden manning the barricades when the threat to academic freedom comes from the external source, when you've done nothing, maybe even been part of it, when it was coming from the internal source. End of sermon.
That was a sermon. Cornel, what do you think about this?
Well, I first just want to begin by saluting you, Brother Glenn. It's almost 15 years of an illustrious academic career, though, brother. You've been everything that Brother Robbie is talking about, which is no matter how much you and I disagree, I've always felt you had a deep commitment to Socratic energy, Socratic dialogue, questioning tacit assumptions and presuppositions. That's what universities are about. At their best, they enact courageous, critical engagement of that which is said and not said across ideological, political lines. And Brother John, it's always a blessing to see you. I know you've been listening to some Stephen Sondheim just like me.
I love that. That was the best talk we had.
Absolutely. But but Brother Robbie and I, for 20 years now, we've been teaching in classroom. We've been traveling the country now for hundreds of different venues. And this book itself is just a culminating moment of our wonderful time together. I love my brother. I respect my brother. I think he's wrong on a number of things. He thinks I'm wrong on a number of things. But more importantly, given the spiritual decay and the moral decrepitude in the American empire right now, well, most people don't want to really engage in integrity, honesty, and decency. So even given the fact that the universities have been so corporatized and commodified for a long time, with a whole lot of groupthink, whole lot of orthodoxy, the very people who are attacking it, Trump and company, they have no interest in the truth either. They have no interest in integrity. They have no interest in honesty at all. So the question becomes, what happens to truth and justice and love in a moment in which gangsterization sets in, which is to say people say and do anything and think there's no accountability, no answerability, no responsibility. You can be academics, you can be politicians, you can be pastors, you can be rabbis, you can be imams. People are posing and posturing. Who is actually saying what they mean and mean what they say and believe that truth is something bigger than them, that justice is something bigger than them? So you get some intellectual humility along with moral tenacity. That's what Brother Robbie and I are talking about. And that's why, a number of people, a significant number of people listen to you all show. I listen too, and I agree with about 20% of it. I said that's
that much, huh?
I learned a whole lot. I'm questioned. I got to examine myself. That's what we need.
Now, Robbie says that the universities had, from within, abandoned or neglected the search for truth. Is that a ideologically neutral criticism, or does it have a coloration? Is it that the universities have leaned too far to the left? Is it that they don't have enough intellectual and political diversity in their ranks? Is it that they've become the promoters of critical studies where the taking down the powerful and undermining the structures of order and hierarchy becomes their main purpose? Something like that. It's not just, is it not, that they've abandoned the pursuit of truth, it's that they've distorted the enterprise, the intellectual enterprise, on behalf of a particular ideological coloration. Or am I wrong? And I'm asking
Glenn, I want to
you,
add to your question.
Yeah, sure.
One thing you rarely learn about from the news is who makes the news, who funds the reporting you're relying on, what agendas shape the coverage. If you read the news but don't consider these questions, you're not being informed. Not really. You need tools to cut through the noise, spot bias, and see the full picture. The tool I use for this is Ground News. It's the website and app I rely on daily to stay informed, cut through the noise, and get closer to the truth. Visit ground.news/Glenn Show to see for yourself how it works. My favorite feature of Ground News is the blind spot feed. It shows you stories that are disproportionately reported by either the left or the right. I find it really helpful for gaining a balanced perspective in our hyperpolarized world, and they surface roughly 20 of these stories every day. To show you what I mean, here's a story that is not being covered by the left. Illegal border crossings hit record low, second month in a row. And here's one that's being ignored by the right. Tariffs to trigger sharp U.S. economic slowdown, chance of recession jumps to 45%, Reuters polls economists. For both of these, and for every story, Ground News gives you a breakdown of the sources covering it, the bias of the media outlets reporting across the left, center, and right, how reliable these sources have been in the past, and who owns them. This is the kind of news analysis you won't find anywhere else. Right now, my viewers can get 40% off the unlimited access Vantage plan, which is the same plan I use. Make sure you subscribe using my link at ground.news/Glenn Show. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code when signing up. That's ground.news/Glenn Show.
Robert, is Professor Eisgruber's first name Chris?
Yes, President Eisgruber. He's the president of our university.
Yeah, okay. Christopher Eisgruber would completely disagree with the sermon that you just gave, which I agree with completely. He would not recognize himself in it, and he would think that you are distorting what Princeton has become. Christopher Eisgruber, I'm sure, I haven't met him, but I'm sure he thinks that the way that he thinks and the things that he sanctioned are truth. He feels like he's arrived at a truth that other people just aren't aware of. He has a religion, although he wouldn't recognize it. And he's not an idiot. He's not crazy. He's a very good person. What would you say to him if he were on this show, where he would really push back against what you said? What would you say in response?
Chris Eisgruber is actually an old friend of mine, as well as the president of my university. We go back more than 40 years. We were graduate students together at Oxford. I bought his bicycle. He sold me his bicycle when we were graduate students together. And then we ended up in the same field. I mean, his primary field is constitutional law. My secondary field is constitutional law. My primary field is philosophy of law. But we've done some teaching together, including at Princeton. We've certainly interacted professionally as scholars, as well as friends for many years. We have a number of disagreements, obviously. He tends to be on the more liberal side of things. I tend to be on the more conservative side of things. And we do have some differences, you're right, John, in our assessment of the current circumstances of universities. He would, I think, object to the scope and depth of my criticism, but he doesn't have his head in the sands. He knows there are problems here, and he has publicly said there are problems here. And one of the problems he's identified goes to Glenn's question, and that is the problem of the absence of viewpoint diversity on campus. He, a few years ago, just before COVID, invited my liberal colleague, Stephen Macedo, who at the time was heading Princeton's University Center for Human Values, and me as the director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions, to convene a meeting with about a dozen Princeton faculty members and then a dozen people from outside the university, scholars from outside the university, specifically to discuss the problem of insufficient viewpoint diversity on campus. He himself came to the meeting. He spent the entire day with us. He recognizes we have a problem here. Now, does he think the problem is as dire as I think it is? I think the answer to that is no, he doesn't think it's dire, but he also doesn't think it's not a problem. He does think it needs to be addressed. Now, he thinks we can address it while maintaining some things that are important to him, especially in what we've come to call the DEI area. He doesn't see the potential conflict, or at least he doesn't see it as necessarily a conflict between his diversity and inclusion goals and academic freedom and viewpoint diversity. I'm more skeptical about that than he is. But while we differ, we're not so far apart that we can't have an intelligent conversation about it or a civil conversation about it. And he does recognize that we do have problems. He's said the same thing about anti-Semitism on campus very recently. While he's been in the forefront, absolutely in the forefront of all university presidents, he's been most in the forefront of criticizing the Trump administration's recent moves in the funding area as part of its campaign against anti-Semitism on campus. He has conceded, that might not even be the right word, he's agreed that there is a problem with anti-Semitism on campus. We recently had it right here on our Princeton campus. An Israeli politician came to speak at our university under the auspices of our Jewish chaplaincies. And his talk was disrupted. He was shouted down. There was an effort to try to. There was someone actually pulled the fire alarm, which ended the conversation. But among the things people were shouting to the Jewish students and to the speaker was, "Go back to Poland." Now that's just a straight up anti-Semitic statement. That's not the criticism of Israel, which is perfectly legitimate. Any government may legitimately be criticized. There are Jewish people in that room who would criticize the current government of Israel, including its war policies. But if you're shouting, "Go back to Poland," we all know what that means. And to his credit, President Eisgruber has acknowledged that we do have problems like that. John, have I been fair? I don't want to dodge your question just because Chris is my boss.
No, I just want to get it out there that I find it very hard to get myself into the mind of someone who says that they realize that there's a problem with the ideological tilt on campuses and a problem with seeking the truth, who would also get furiously behind all of that anti-racism agitprop in 2020, 2021 on that campus, for example, that hideous manifesto that went out. He stood behind that and yet feels that Princeton is committed to a search for neutral truth. I just personally, I'm not saying that you are a phony, because you're not. I'm not calling him a phony, but I can no more get into that person's head on that than I can get into the head of, well, somebody who I really don't understand.
Cornel, were you not at Princeton in 2020?
No, I don't know where I was 2020, but
But you have been at Princeton. You were on the faculty there, and you decamped.
Can I interrupt there? Because I believe I can remember this pretty well. I think Cornel was at Harvard, and I remember getting a phone call from Cornel when it was suddenly announced that President Eisgruber had decided to remove Woodrow Wilson's name from the building that houses what was the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs and is now simply the School of Public and International Affairs. And Cornel called me because he had been in conversations with his daughter, Zaytun. I call her my niece, Zaytun. She calls me Uncle Robbie, who was here as an undergraduate at the time and is still here as a graduate student. And Zaytun had said to her father, Cornel, this is being done with no real consultation. It seems to be just an executive order with no serious discussion about it. No matter how one thinks the question ultimately ought to be resolved, it shouldn't be by some sort of fiat. There should be some broad-ranging discussion, and then we decide what to do. So, Cornel, do you remember that?
Oh, absolutely. I called you right away and said, we went into the president's office in 1975 as a graduate student. I was a graduate student there in philosophy, but Larry Morris and Hank Coleman in economics, Craig Watson in economics. You might know them, Brother Glenn. And we sat in the president's office and said, we have an argument against Woodrow Wilson, given the resegregation and given the birth of the nation, ... Yeah. He gave a counter argument and said, no, Woodrow Wilson was our president. I agree with Woodrow Wilson trying to eliminate all of the eating clubs on Prospect. I'm in solidarity with Woodrow Wilson in that regard. Also, the graduate college where I lived, as well as my beloved daughter. She's a third-year graduate student right now in the German department. But we had an argument. We went back and forth. So I agreed with the elimination of the name. I just felt that it was coercive. It was forced. There was no Socratic energy, so that it sent a bad message to students thinking you don't have to argue your way through. All you have to do is just enact brute force. So you got Thrasymachus trumping Socrates. And I told the students that themselves. I said, we put forward the arguments in 75. I think we had the best arguments, but we lost. So it stayed around for another 40, some 50 years. But then how does it disappear? No argument at all. No deliberation of students, no deliberation of faculty, just fiat. Boom, it's gone. Why is it gone? Fear, force, coercion. That's not a good sign in terms of trying to shape the souls and character and integrity and honesty of young people.
Cornel, you've been a fierce critic, as I recall, of Israel's prosecution of the war in Gaza and of the occupation and so on. And you've been outspoken about it. Do you agree that that kind of sentiment often gets difficult to disentangle from anti-Semitism, which I'm sure you would also oppose vociferously? And what do you think can be done to allow for a vigorous critical voice that doesn't ignore the humanity of our Jewish brothers and sisters?
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful question. I mean, in the hundreds of talks that I've given over the decades, let alone the number of talks I've given in the last few years, for me, it's always a question of making sure that the critique that you have of any structure of domination or peoples is one that is contextualized, pluralized, and humanized. And what I mean by that is, in fact, that you recognize there's always going to be xenophobic voices in any movement. No movement is pure and pristine. When you speak, you have to let folk know we have no patience, no room whatsoever for anti-Jewish hatred, anti-Jewish sentiment, just like we have no space for anti-Palestinian hatred, anti-Palestinian hate. So the same is true anti-white or anti-black. Now, that's the speeches that I give. Now, you're going to get some voices there that are xenophobic. There's no doubt about that. Every Jewish community's got xenophobic voices against Palestinian and black folk. Every black community's got xenophobic voices against whites or gays and lesbians. Every Palestinian community has xenophobic voices against Jews and others. But in your speaking, you have to make it clear this is the moral and spiritual compass from which we need to focus on in order to come to terms with these 25,000 children been killed in months. And then I make the point too. I said, but if those 25,000 children were white or Israeli, what would be the response of the U.S. government? Very, very different. If they were being killed by African and Arabs, it would be very, very different. A Palestinian baby has exactly the same value as a white baby, a black baby, a brown baby, and so forth. And then I always lay out my Christian sensibility. I learned in Shiloh Baptist Church, Jesus loved the little children, all the children of the world, red or yellow, black or white. They are precious in his sight. That's the humanistic stance that we have to have that would shatter all tribalisms and all racisms.
On the tribalism point, Glenn, to go back to your previous question about the universities, there's no question that you have tribalism on the right as well as the left. I have said to my conservative friends and colleagues so often, if we had the kind of ideological monopoly on universities that the left has today, we'd probably be behaving the same way they are behaving. So we have to have a little grace here, even as we carry out the critique and demand that there be greater viewpoint neutrality. Now, why should there be greater viewpoint neutrality? Some people think it's a matter of being fair to conservatives. Well, there's something to that, but that's not the primary concern. That shouldn't be the primary motivation. It's important to be fair to everybody, including fair to conservatives and fair to liberals. But the primary motivation, certainly what motivates me in this campaign, is to restore the university to its truth-seeking mission. The problem is not just unfairness to conservatives, that's secondary. The absence of conservative voices means that arguments that need to be heard by scholars and by students, points that need to be made, lines of consideration that have to be explored are not being made, not being heard, not being explored. And what's the casualty of all that? Truth. Because what you end up with just ideology, groupthink, conformism. Nobody's actually questioning the dominant orthodoxies, the positions on campus. And if there's one thing we know from human history, it is that dominant voices can be very, very, very wrong, but they're going to remain dominant until somebody can and does challenge them.
How do you feel about the prospects of cutting through all of this noise and actually convincing people that something has gone wrong beyond small circles? How do we make a real change?
Well, the public, I think, knows that something has gone wrong. I referred earlier, John, to the collapse of trust in universities. And what's interesting, if you look at the survey data, Glenn probably knows this better than I do. So if I get it wrong, Glenn, correct me. But my understanding of the survey data is that you've had a complete collapse of support for universities among people who identify as Republican or conservative. But you've also had a very substantial decline, not a complete collapse, but a very substantial decline among people who identify as Democrat and liberal. If that doesn't cause the alarm bells to go off among university leaders, among the university establishment, I don't know what will. Now, I do, John, have an agenda that, together with Cornel and others, I've been trying to prosecute. I've tried to drag you into this yourself, John, as you know, for the reform of universities. And I think the strategy is twofold. First is to build infrastructure within existing institutions where you can. And I don't mean by infrastructure conservative infrastructure. I mean build programs, institutes, schools within universities that will model for the entire university the truth-seeking spirit that should manifest itself in the entire university, but at the moment doesn't. So I applaud, and I've been involved in, building the prototype was the Madison program at Princeton. But now we've got so many other programs at state universities, at private universities, in civic education, in Western civilization. And I think those are an engine of reform for the universities more broadly. Now, there are all sorts of things that could go wrong. There are potholes. There are traps you can fall into. They can become themselves ideologized. You don't want that to happen. So we're gonna have to execute this properly. But I think that's the first step, the first strategy. Build infrastructure within existing institutions and reform the ones you can from within. Now, the second strategy, or the second prong, is build alternatives where you cannot build infrastructure within existing institutions. And that is going to be especially important when it comes to what I sometimes call para-academic institutions. Those are the institutions that play such an outsized role in credentialing people for academic careers and academic advancement, and accrediting. It's the stuff that goes on behind the stage in academia, which dictates the stuff that you see on the stage. Everybody sees what's happening on the stage. Some people applaud, they like it. Some people boo because they don't like it. Everybody sees the same thing on the stage. But what's happening on the stage, who gets on the stage, what they say, what they do, is largely determined by organizations, para-academic institutions off the stage. The great honor societies, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Sciences, the professional associations in the fields, the academic, what once were the academic freedom organizations like the AAUP and the ACLU and so forth and so on. Well, a lot of those institutions, honestly, have dropped the ball. They've themselves become politicized and ideologized. They're talking about a lack of viewpoint diversity. Look at some of those institutions. And so The second prong of the strategy is create organizations like the one that Cornel and I joined in with others in helping create, the Academic Freedom Alliance, which really is doing the work that the American Association of University Professors, AAUP, should be doing, or the ACLU should be doing. But they're not doing it. They're not doing it right. So we need to create new organizations. We tend to partner with organizations like Heterodox Academy and like FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. And we can't seem to find ways to cooperate very well with the AAUP, for example, because they've got a different agenda. The New American Academy of Sciences and Letters is another example of this. The Berry Scholarships Program in Oxford, which is doing what the Rhodes Program and the Marshall programs, historically did and should be doing, but they too have, for want of a better word, gone woke. And again, you have the exclusion of anybody who's not with the ideological program. I began to notice about 2008, 2009, that students of mine who very likely would have been Rhodes or Marshall scholars were not even being interviewed for those scholarships. And I could see what was happening. It was an ideological screen going up, and they were screening out anybody who had views, political views, moral views, religious views that weren't with the program.
Meaning conservatives.
Well, conservatives, evangelical Christians, faithful Catholics.
I see.
Anybody who wasn't with the program. And so we created the Berry Scholars Program, which selects students. They just announced the 14 for this year, just yesterday, as a matter of fact, who go over to Oxford for degree programs on the same terms as the Rhodes and the Marshall. The criteria of selection are the traditional Rhodes criteria: scholarship, leadership, and character, plus one more, which is independence of mind. Scholarship, leadership, character, and independence of mind. And I guess we're now in the 7th year of the Berry program, and the program is absolutely flourishing at Oxford. And we've been adding 2 new scholars a year. As I say, this year is 14. Next year will be 16. The year after that will be 18, and it'll grow into the 20s. So it's just another example of that second prong of the strategy, which is just where you can't build infrastructure within an existing organization, build a new one, and then go into business against the legacy institutions the way Gimbel's goes into business against Macy's.
I have a question for you guys. It's about truth. So you want ideological or political diversity in the pursuit of truth. And I'm just wondering if that's not somehow a contradiction. I mean, if I thought capitalism was morally wrong, and I thought that claim about the moral status of capitalism was true, why would I, encourage the teaching of free market economics and ensure that I had a representative or a diverse engagement with that? I mean, in the sciences, we don't have the equivalent of ideological diversity. What we have is the community gets behind the best assessment that can be made at the current time of what is true. And it excludes consciously flat earthers and others who are wrong, quote unquote, demonstrably wrong about their position. Why isn't something like that also true about if I thought a genocide was being perpetrated and I said so and I believe that, why wouldn't I want to preclude people who were advocating for the genocide? If I thought racism was being furthered by diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, et cetera, you see where I'm going. I'm asking, what role does judgment of truth play in constituting the university in the first place? Do you see what I'm getting at?
Oh, no, indeed. It's a wonderful, wonderful question, though, brother. But I think I like to begin looking at this from the vantage point of what happens in a culture when truth collapses and when courage and trust collapse, because truth itself is bigger than all of us, and you have to have enough trust in your interlocutors who are speaking from some vantage point of integrity for the conversation to continue in the pursuit of truth. Now, see, we're in a situation now where people don't trust each other. And if you don't trust each other, you can't have a conversation. Well, truth is not about some kind of unmediated access is only by means of adducement of evidence and argument and vision and story and analysis and symbols deployed to try to get people to see things they didn't see before and to convince people to convince things that they were not convinced before. So you can have a long, sustained argument with a follower of Adam Smith as opposed to Ricardo, as opposed to Marx, as opposed to Leontief, as opposed to Samuelson, as opposed to Loury. I mean, economics itself doesn't have one paradigm. You got a whole host of folks. They don't read Joseph Schumpeter anymore. They don't read Carl Polanyi anymore. How come? There's no deep historical sense when it comes to economics. It's been mathematicized. That's a certain kind of bias. There's some insights there. Whole lot of shortcomings and blindnesses with quantitative analysis vis-a-vis economics. So even in the science, even in the physics, you got Einsteinians against the followers of wave and particle theory. They're going at each other's throats. Thomas Kuhn taught us that in Science Structure Scientific Revolution, right? The problem is that no matter what discipline is, if you don't have truth operating and the people are not courageous enough to raise the issues and be unpopular in their critique, and everybody just wants to fit in, everybody just wants to go along with the dominant paradigm, then you no longer have the very preconditions for truth. And one last point, too, I think it's very important for us to keep in mind that Brother Robbie and I, we're not nostalgic about some grand moment in the past when the university embodied all this rich Socratic energy. No way. No way. The university has always been driven too often by cowardly presidents who capitulate to power. Look at Columbia pushing out Charles Beard in World War II. Look at their response to McCarthyism in the 60s at Harvard, booting out Paul Sweezy and so forth. Why is it that we have to wait till Kilson to get tenure at Harvard in 1969, or Glenn Loury at 33 years old get tenure in economics? We had some Negroes and Black folk who could have got tenure before that. They had certain racism going on. We have to be honest about that. Martha Nussbaum becomes the first Society Fellow in 1973, and the great organization is founded by Alfred Whitehead in 1933. 40 years, you got to wait for any sister to become a member of the Society of Fellows with Kuhn and Quine and all of these giants can be a part of? No. The university has never been able to fully enact the ideal. Brother Robbie and I are calling for the reaffirmation of the Socratic ideal of serious argument across the board. But it has always failed, and it probably always will fail. We just have to look at the nature of the failure now. The nature of the failure now is just so deep. There's a moral and spiritual bankruptcy in so many of these universities, and it needs to be recast.
I really hope to see that there can be some kind of generational shift. I mean, all of the efforts that you're talking about sound absolutely fantastic. I've been rather naive about many of them. It can be dismaying to see that for so many people with PhDs now, their impression is that to engage in the life of the mind is to critique, as they put it, power differentials. For them, that's what being smart is. That is what the quest for the truth consists of, and nothing else. They wouldn't recognize themselves in the charge, but then how many of us do when we're criticized from the outside? But for them, this thing they call critique is seeking the truth, and they don't realize what a narrow band of truth that is. And, a lot of them now, the age that I am, I remember when those people didn't have gray hair yet. But now they have gray hair and they're controlling hiring. They are quite certain and they are quite proud of their sense of what the truth is. And they pass it on to their grad students. They don't admit grad students who aren't with that program. They think they've found truth. They know that Stalin didn't, but they think that they're at the end of time and they did. And goodness, they control an awful lot. It scares me. I've seen my own subfield basically just destroyed by that kind of frame of mind, Creole studies. And so I worry. There are times when I just want to grab my marbles and go home, but that frankly isn't constructive. And so I really hope that this works and that people can listen if there's anybody left who can.
Notice I might interject that this is more a problem in the humanities
And social sciences.
And the social sciences that it is, and engineering, mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, and so on. And that takes me back to my question about whether or not the authority of truth works to some degree against the imperative of ideological diversity.
Let me take a crack at that. But first, if I could just say something in view of what John just said, which I completely agree with. When I arrived at Princeton University, fresh out of graduate school back in the Middle Ages in 1985, the typical academic attitude, and this was true of faculty as well as students, was one of a kind of lazy, careless, polite relativism. So people would say things, you remember this, well, there's really no such thing as truth. There's your truth. There's my truth. There's really no such thing as truth. There's just opinion. People have different opinions. It was the kind of thing that, you still occasionally hear at a cocktail party or maybe in a freshman class. But that lazy, casual relativism has been replaced by a fierce absolutism. And it has made me think, John, honest to God, it has made me think sometimes, you know what? I'd just love to go back to the old casual relativism because it was less dangerous than this ferocious absolutism. And the proper posture, and this will lead me to Glenn's question, the proper posture is neither of those things. It's not the casual relativism, and it's certainly not the fierce absolutism. It's the spirit of Socratic inquiry. There's a reason Socrates operated dialectically, as we say, if I can introduce that fancy. We're just really by going back and forth, putting the best arguments on one side on the table and then juxtaposing them with the best arguments on the other side and, try to get at the truth of matters that way. So now this takes me directly to Glenn's question. The first thing I would say, Glenn, is any serious truth seeker, again, one thing we learned from Socrates, any serious truth seeker is cognizant, not merely notionally, but really existentially cognizant, aware of his own fallibility. No matter how deeply persuaded he is, no matter how emotionally invested he is in a particular view, no matter how certain he is, we have to be aware, if we're going to be truth-oriented people, of our own fallibility. History, again, here is our guide. People have been wrong. And not only like ordinary people, the greatest thinkers have often been wrong. And they've been wrong not only about the minor, trivial, superficial things of life. We frail, fallible, fallen human beings can be wrong. Even the most brilliant among us can be wrong about the big, important things, about matters of human nature, the human good, human rights, human dignity, human destiny, questions of meaning, value. So we've got to be aware of that, no matter how confident we are in our view. And that should always lead us open to the possibility of being challenged. If somebody's got an argument to bring, if someone's prepared to do business with us in the proper currency of intellectual discourse, this currency of intellectual discourse, just as there's an economic currency, pounds and pence in Britain, dollars and cents in the United States, the currency of intellectual discourse is reasons, arguments, and evidence. If someone's just shouting at you, or someone's coming at you with no reasons, no arguments, no evidence, just preaching at you, well, there, Glenn, no reason to pay attention to that. You don't have to take that seriously. But if someone is challenging even your most deeply held convictions, even those you're most certain about, and is prepared to do business in the currency of reasons and arguments and evidence, you've got to be open to that. Your own sense of your fallibility and the intellectual humility that awareness, that more than merely notional awareness of your fallibility will produce, will make you open to being challenged. Now, John Stuart Mill, the famous defender of freedom of speech, in that second chapter of his book on liberty, Mill, of course, being the great 19th century British philosopher, introduces what's come to be known as Mill's trident. And at the risk of lecturing a little bit, let me just tell the audience what that is. So if two people have a debate, they have an argument about something, they disagree about something, there are only a limited number of possibilities. Let's say the debate is between Brother Cornel and me. I could be completely right, and Cornel could be completely wrong. Cornel could be completely right, and I could be completely wrong. Or I could be partially right and partially wrong, and Cornel could be partially right and partially wrong. Now, if I'm serious about the truth, and the reality of the matter is that I'm entirely wrong and Cornel's entirely right, then it's a darn good thing for me to respect his freedom of speech and to allow myself to be challenged, because my only hope of getting the false ideas out of my head so that I can swap in true ideas for them is to allow him to challenge me and to give his reasons and arguments on the table, so he'll bring me from error to truth. And the same is true if the reality is that I'm partially right, but partially wrong. And Cornel, though partially wrong, is also partially right. Here too, if I'm to eliminate the errors in my head, move from falsehood to truth in the dimensions in which I'm wrong, I need to be open to being challenged. I need to allow him to speak, and not just allow him to speak, but to actually listen to him in a truth-seeking spirit. But then here's the Glenn case. Here's the case, Glenn, you're putting in front of us. What if the truth of the matter, what if the reality is just this? Cornel is 100% wrong and I'm 100% right. Why should I tolerate his free speech? Why should I even listen to him? And the third prong, the third tine of Mill's trident tells us the reason. And that is, even if you're 100% right, you could check the right box on the SAT test. You could check the right box on the true-false test. Your knowledge of a subject matter will be deepened if you allow yourself to consider what, even though misguided, an intelligent, well-informed critic has to say. Why, in this case, my example, Cornel, had arrived at the position that he's arrived at. After all, it's one thing to know that something is true. It's a good thing. It's much better than being wrong about it. It's one thing to know that something is true, but it's another thing and a deeper thing and a better thing to know not only that it's true, but why it's true, how it's true, how its truth might relate to other things that are true, other things that are the case. And that can be learned even when you're engaging with a critic that you are certain is wrong. And then one final point, just a little bit of empirical evidence here. You use the example of capitalism. If I'm convinced that capitalism is 100% right, why should I listen to anybody who challenges it? Well, I happen to be convinced that Marxism is 100% wrong. And not only is it wrong, that it's probably responsible for more evil in the world than any other ideology that has ever existed. And yet, I have to acknowledge that, at least to my mind, still the greatest work on the history of American slavery, Gene Genovese's Roll, Jordan, Roll, the Slaves Made, was written by Eugene Genovese in his high Marxist period. Now, would I have wanted to exclude Eugene Genovese because he's a Marxist? Had we done that? Richard Nixon wanted to do it. You might recall, Glenn, Richard Nixon made Gene Genovese a campaign issue.
No, I didn't know that.
Fired from Rutgers. But no, we would not. Any truth-oriented person is going to acknowledge that towering achievement that this Marxist historian, he later abandoned Marxism, returned to his boyhood Catholicism, but he wrote it during his high Marxist period, and it was and is an enormous contribution to intellectual life that is to be honored by anybody who wants to get at the truth of matters. So there are my reasons for honoring the free speech, and not only honoring free speech, but listening to people, even when I think they're dead wrong.
Robert, I want to say this as
go ahead.
I'm sorry, I just got to, on Marx. Okay, because I was trained at MIT by Paul Samuelson and company, and we were neoliberal economists, and, we didn't believe in Marx either. But later in life, I actually spent some time reading Marx, and I thought, if I was sitting in 1844, 1855, 1865, watching industrial capitalism and so forth stand itself up, there were some real issues that he was engaging with and attempting to come to terms with it. And even if I don't like the labor theory of value as an account for how prices get set, and even if I don't like what Lenin and Stalin and company ended up and Pol Pot and Mao Zedong doing on the ground in the name of it, the intellectual problem that Marx was trying to grapple with was one that needed, to be grappled with. And we learned something from the failed attempt to give an account of the modern economic world that is Das Kapital in its 3 volumes, I'd say. So I just want to put that on the record.
Absolutely right. In our courses together, Cornel and I have taught Antonio Gramsci's prison notebooks. Gramsci, of course, was the great both Marxist theoretician and politician, died in one of Mussolini's prisons. Now, do I have any? And the same would be for Cornel. Cornel's not a Marxist. He has no ideological love for Gramsci. Do we learn stuff from that great so-called cultural Marxist Gramsci? Absolutely, we do. We assign him to our students. As a conservative, I don't feel like I'm compromising or I'm betraying my cause by assigning Gramsci. I want my students to learn from Gramsci.
Gramsci's got a whole lot to say, but nobody has a monopoly on truth. But the crucial thing is class struggle and class conflict is real. And one doesn't have to be a Marxist to come to acknowledge that. I think that's part of Glenn's question. But I do think there's a rationalistic bias in both you and Brother Glenn's point, or Brother Robert. It is to say that it's the difference between Descartes and Vico, that we're not looking solely at reasons and evidence. We're looking at also stories. We're looking at narratives. You can read William Blake on London and be more moved to become a socialist than reading Marx. Why? Because he's got pictures. He's got powerful poetic displays of human beings who are being degraded. And this is true in religious traditions too. It's not just rational evidence. It's using the imagination in a number of different ways. And one of the problems of a highly commodified university where 65% are in computer science is that their moral imagination is thoroughly underdeveloped. And they're sitting there looking at internet movements, 65% of their attention span, attention focus, that their moral imagination is underdeveloped. And that also is tied to making it difficult to cultivate courage. They all become conformists. They just want to fit in. They want money. They want status. They want position. They want spectacle. That's a spiritual decay in the empire as a whole, across ideology, across color, across sexual orientation. That's why the centrality of music and poetry and story and narrative and history becomes crucial in this regard. And so I don't think you all would oppose that, but it's not just a matter of reasons and evidence. It's not just a matter of statistical analysis and quantitative projects. No, something else is happening at this deeper human level that we are missing out on in our young people.
Cornel, does that mean, if I may, that in order to adjudicate and have a constructive discussion about Gaza, that it's a mic drop point to show a photograph of a neighborhood that's been physically destroyed by Israel's bombs?
No,
that's
there's no such thing as a mic drop point, though, brother. The argument must be relentless. It's endless. And people are changing their minds, we hope, if they're taking claims seriously, evidence seriously, pictures seriously, and so forth and so on. But to the degree to which you think we can just reach a conversation stopper, which is Richard Rorty's language. He was my dear brother and teacher. He's wrong as 2 left shoes in that regard. It's got to go on.
Robert, what you said about 3 beats ago could be excerpted as this just lesson in wisdom. Perfectly put. I mean, you're correct. That's just true. There's truth there, that is the way we should approach these things. And I think most people would not disagree, except I wonder how far they could go in actually applying it when it's about something they have emotions about. And so everything you said is true, but then, whoops, Gaza. And I think we know, especially in university culture, the typical person just thinks settler colonialism, and that's it. And there is no other view. And if you have another view, you get something thrown in your face. I get the feeling that for many people, all of that sounds lovely, but more if you're arguing about whether or not people should smoke cigarettes or about even Marxism, but not whiteness and power.
John, be careful because the point cuts both ways. I mean, there are mic drop claims on all sides of that dispute. So, it's not just the settler colonialism out, therefore Israel bad. It's also the Hamas are the Nazis, and therefore Gaza has to be destroyed. I mean, that's also a similarly emotion-driven point. I mean, isn't it? So
but also,
anyway.
In terms of universities, the fact that 13 universities can be destroyed, every brick, and not one university professor in the United States can say a mumbling word about the massive demolishing of universities, laboratories, dorms, and so forth and so on. No, because they think if they say that, they'll be viewed as pro-Palestinian. It's just a matter of trying to speak a truth that cuts through all kinds of different contexts. And if we're in a situation where we can't speak truths that cut across context, then we're just locked into our own narrow tribal perspectives, and the humanistic perspectives gets crushed. Well, some of us are going to be humanistic till the day we die, even if we're a little small group in a corner.
I could go back just for a moment to the challenge that Cornel presented to you and to me, Glenn. If you read the book, if you read Truth Matters, the book that Cornel and I have just put out, we get into a wrestling match at one point where Cornel is basically accusing me of being a rationalist, and I'm essentially accusing Cornel of being a fideist. I want to try to reason my way to my conclusions every time. And Cornel insists that no, there are some times when reason just gives out. You still have to take a stand, and you do that on the basis of a leap of faith, and maybe one that's informed by your aesthetic sense or something other than the sort of strict rational evaluation of arguments that I present. Now, as we wrestle with each other, what are we forcing each other to do? If you read the book, you'll say we're forcing each other to modify and to enter caveats and to enter nuances. And pretty soon it becomes clear that, we're not, once we've got things clarified, once we've got the caveats in, once we have the nuances, we're not far apart as it appeared at the beginning when I was a rationalist and he was a fideist. Now, we still disagree. He's still fundamentally a Kierkegaardian. I'm still fundamentally an Aristotelian. We do disagree about that. But it turns out that disagreement is not as wide as you would think at the beginning. Yeah.
Now, you're both Christians, no?
Yeah, that's also a point. That's also a point of commonality. But before we go to that, I want to go to John's the point John just made, which I think is really important, and I don't want to drop it. It's about our emotional investment in our convictions. So here's the way I see it. I think we human beings quite naturally tend to wrap our emotions more or less tightly around our convictions. Our convictions help to form our identities. Some of the communities that we belong to and we value our belonging to are communities of shared conviction. So we wrap our emotions more or less tightly around our convictions. That's the human condition. Now, that's not wrong in itself. In fact, in itself, it's a good thing. If we didn't make some emotional investment in our convictions, we really would never act on our convictions, not just when it comes to big causes, civil rights or whatever your cause is. It's not just that we wouldn't go out and do the big things. We wouldn't do even ordinary things. It's one thing to believe, it would be a nice thing to get the kids up in the morning, get them washed up, get them dressed, get them fed and off to school. But unless you have some emotional investment in that, it's just going to be a good idea and you're never actually going to do it. You need an emotional investment in it in order to get it done. And a fortiori, of course, the same is true when it comes to making sacrifices for good causes, taking risks, advocating, getting people upset. So forth and so on. So it's not bad in itself. But here's the thing. If we wrap our emotions too tightly around our convictions, and it is a perennial temptation to do that, we become dogmatists. We become ideologues. We refuse to listen to somebody else's point of view. And we want a point of view that challenges the convictions that we've emotionally so invested in to be suppressed, to be shut down. And then that's the end of truth seeking. We become tribalists, pure, simple tribalists. And we don't want to be that. The plea that Cornel and I are making in Truth Matters is don't be a tribalist. This is a very anti-tribalist book. Now, that's a hard argument to make to people because we really do value our membership in communities that are partly communities of conviction. And Cornel and I both have this experience, and I'll bet you guys too have it too. And that is you're a member of a community, you're a member of good standing in a community, you're even an admired member of the community, you're treated as a spokesman for the community. But then the community lands on a position that you just don't think is right. You just don't think is defensible. And you have the temerity to express your dissent. Well, now you're worse than an outsider. You're a heretic. You're a betrayer. You're Judas Iscariot.
Tell me about
Cornel
it.
and I can tell you about 2016, when I refused to endorse Donald Trump and Cornel refused to endorse Hillary Clinton. We were suddenly no longer members of good standing in communities that had celebrated us. But we just said, no, we can't go along with this.
Absolutely.
You're out.
Absolutely. And any time empathy is viewed as an enemy and cruelty is viewed as a strategy, you know you're not in a moral zone. You know you're not in an ethical place. And if you want to be in an ethical place, or at least make an effort to be, then it requires some Socratic self-examination and some prophetic courage to tell the truth, even if they're going to cut your neck off.
And that's left as well as right. Yeah, exactly.
I can remember from my study of the Bible, the passage, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And it makes me want to ask you, Christian philosophers, about the relationship between faith and truth. I think we're in this zone right now when we talk about narrative and empathy and so on. How do you square a commitment that transcends reason on the one hand with a devotion to the pursuit of truth as the raison d'etre of being in the university?
I mean, I don't think you square it in the sense of ever being able to produce the kind of clear, distinct, rational argument that Descartes and company would want us to produce. You can't do it. You have to begin with pushing as far as you can in terms of our critical intelligence, and then recognizing we're critically intelligent enough to know that critical intelligence has its limits. And what do you do when you're living on those limits? What Rilke called living the question as opposed to just asking the question. Well, then you have leaps of faith. And by faith, you're really talking about the fiduciary dimension in the human condition, which takes us back to trust again. You see? And this is true for any enterprise. There's always going to be underdeveloped or underdetermined evidence you have to go beyond. That's true for physics. That's true in biology. It's certainly true in literature and arts and in religion. And you had to be honest enough to say that I am making claims that I do not have wholesale evidence for, but I'm convinced it's the best that I can do at the moment. And then when it comes to religion, we just go to South Side Chicago, brother, and say, hey, I tried Jesus and it worked. Jamal tried Jesus and it didn't work. Shaniqua tried Jesus and it worked half the time. Well, okay, but you got to go for what you think is enabling you to accent the best inside of you, which is the love, the courage, the integrity, the honesty, and so forth. For Baldwin, it didn't work. Fine. For Toni Morrison, Catholic all her life, going to mass every morning. It worked in an interesting kind of way because she got some voodoo and other things working. Other folk, secular to the core. All of us make our choices. We're lifting our voices, but there's no algebraic formula that's going to lead toward a conclusion that is airtight when it comes to do the indeterminate, the opaque, the oblique dimensions of what it is to be human. And yet that's what so much of the good stuff is in the opaque things, love and other such phenomena.
I don't understand that. I don't know what it means, and I never will. And I really wish I could, because I can see the joy and sense of purpose that it gives most human beings. I wish I could understand that. I don't know what that means about love.
But it's your love of Sondheim, brother.
Well, if that can be part of it, okay.
Isn't that an analogy right there?
You're saying truth is not the whole picture. There's something beyond truth. That's what I'm taking from what you're saying. Faith is operating in a different register than truth. And that's a question.
Well, okay. Deep waters here, but important waters. For Islam and Judaism and most of the Protestant traditions of Christianity, there is no settled doctrinal understanding of the relationship between faith and reason, and no exclusion of either a rationalist approach or a fideist approach. Fideism meaning the school of thought that says there's really nothing important that we can know by our reason. Our reason has been too badly corrupted. It's too fallen. It's too weak. It's too unreliable. You can't really know anything. I mean, you can know things that are ultimately that, maybe really interesting and maybe important things about physics and mathematics and so forth, but not the existentially important things. The existentially important things you can only know by faith. Catholicism is the outlier here because there is a settlement of that issue within Catholicism. It's a doctrinal teaching, and it is that faith and reason are not antithetical to each other, are not in tension, and fideism is unacceptable. So fideism is ruled out as a matter of doctrine, which means that that truths, even the truths that are known by faith, are subject to rational scrutiny. That if something actually is contradicted, say, by science, if it can be shown that it's contradicted by science, then it must be abandoned. It can't be true as a matter of faith and false as a matter of reason. So on the Catholic, I myself am Catholic, on the Catholic understanding, faith and reason are, to use a metaphor that is the opening sentence of a great encyclical by Pope John Paul II, who was a very, very good philosopher, professional philosopher, at the beginning of his encyclical Fides et Ratio, which is translated from the Latin as faith and reason. The metaphor is this. He says, faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit ascends to contemplation of the truth. They're not hostile or antithetical to each other. They are rather mutually supporting. You can't actually ultimately do without either one of them. You need them. I grew up in the hills of West Virginia, and one of the things that we did there was hunting. And if you shot a bird, if you shot a grouse or a pheasant and you winged it, you damaged one wing, the bird would fall to the ground, still alive, one wing working perfectly well, and it would flap that good wing furiously to try to get back up off the ground. But because of the damage to the other wing, the bird would just go in circles on the ground. Could never get up off the ground because you need both wings. You need faith and reason operating in a kind of harmony. And on that understanding, what faith is most fundamentally is not a way of knowing something that you can't know by reason. It's rather a matter of trust. Faith is fundamentally about trust. And we call Abraham a man of faith. We call him a man of faith, or the man of faith, because he trusted God. Not that he, believed in God then when there was no evidence of God. It's that he was willing to trust God. Faith is fundamentally a matter of trust. And it's hard to trust. It's hard to trust other people. It's hard to trust God, even if you believe in God. There's too much bad stuff in the world. We're too vulnerable. Terrible things can happen to the very best people. So that's how I approach it, Glenn. I don't see a problem here. And it might be because I'm a Catholic and not a member of some fideistic sort of tradition, including secular versions of fideism.
One of the greatest Catholic thinkers of all time, and he's the greatest embodiment of fideism.
You're going to bring up Pascal.
Blas is, get too much deeper than Blas.
Yeah, I knew it.
You know what I mean? But the point is that it's a matter of just calling for help. You see, that bird is one-winged, and grace will kick in and help that joker. And he'll be able to have some aid beyond his own autonomy. And that's what I meant by Southside Chicago. So if you're coming from a context where you're damaged existentially, but creative in your response, then you recognize no matter how autonomous you are interdependent and you are in need of help. I lift up mine eyes unto the hill from what cometh my help, says 121 Psalm, right?
My help cometh
Exactly. You
from the
see,
Lord.
that's starting. That's an acknowledgement of exhausting all of critical intelligence, all rationality, all human capacity, going beyond Hamlet now. Hamlet is the most intellectually sophisticated figure of all of modern literature, and Shakespeare is the bard that's in a league of his own. Hamlet suffers from the incapacity, not just to love, but to recognize he needs the aid of someone else, not just his father telling him to kill somebody. Shakespeare understood that, but not in argument. It's in the greatest play that we know in early modern Europe. It's in Hamlet. That's what our young people need to hear, you see.
That to me comes down to what I was talking about when I was talking about trust. Trusting in God, relying.
John is shaking his head.
The view is, the proposition is that there is a power beyond ourselves that actually cares about us. That's the claim, and that we can enter into a kind of relationship. We can enter into a sort of friendship with that more than merely human power, that more than merely human source of meaning and value. We sort of experience ourselves, in fact, more than sort of, we do experience ourselves as spiritual beings. That is, as agents. That is, in exercising rationality and freedom of the will, which are not material, can't be accounted for by material means. They are, strictly speaking, spiritual powers. And that produces what Ayaan Hirsi Ali has recently, I think, put her finger on, a kind of longing for friendship with a more than merely human source of meaning and value. And I think it's very oblique to John. I think John's thinking, I just don't get it, right?
I don't belong in this world. I am utterly mystified by Ayaan Hirsi Ali's transition. Utterly mystified. I don't understand this. I feel alone. I'm sorry. I am.
Well, don't feel alone, John. I was just going to comment. I talk about this in my memoir. I just want to say this, Cornel, just quickly. I crawled into the church on my hands and knees when my life was absolutely devastated and I had nowhere else to turn. And I lifted my eyes unto those hills and I found help. But I've lost it. And the rational dimension has, had its way with me. And I can't, it's like looking up at the cloud and seeing the profile of Abraham Lincoln played out for you, and then the winds blow, you look away, you look back again, and you can't find it. And that's where I am.
No, that's at work in your powerful memoir, though, brother. But I think of people like Wittgenstein, Chekhov, and others who believe that they could go in context, let's say a church or a mosque, and they see the power of the ritual and say it's too beautiful to be true. And therefore they're wrestling with their unbelief, but they're moved by the story, the music, and so forth and so on. And arts can play that role. That right back to Brother John's point, that it's hard to understand the genius of a Sondheim without recognizing how his music transports you in such a way that you don't have a rational account of it. Now, that is a real analogy. And that's falling in love too. If we had a long time to go into Brother John's love life, then my hunch is we're gonna have some examples of something that transports him in magnificent ways with joy and ecstasy and bliss and pain and hurt. We know they all go together, and yet there's not a rational account that is required in order to be truthful about that experience. Is that fair, Brother John?
It is, but yes, I can feel transported, but my sense is that all of that ultimately is chemicals that we're probably, especially with AI, just on the verge of discovering exactly how it works. And that we're probably just on the verge of figuring out what consciousness is and how it emerged. And it was probably deep down in the sea at those heated vents. It's all just chemicals. And that makes more sense to me than anything else. And I am not trying to be dismissive of the other way of looking at things because it's the one that most human beings have. But wow, I wish I could walk into a church and get that feeling. And the second act Sunday in the Park with George, yes, it's absolutely amazing, but it would not shape my morality. I think that that music is chemicals, and I think that story being about a creator who has a hard time reaching out and connecting with Dot, the song Finishing the Hat is very much me, in that I want to finish the hat rather than chatting, which frankly is kind of sad.
I see.
So,
yeah.
So John, do you care about things that you care about, including what you regard to be right and wrong, sort of from a distance? So you do care about them, but when you step back from it, you now look at yourself from an external vantage point and you say, well, all that's really going on there is not anything that would justify my caring about them. It's just the atoms are firing in a certain way, or the neurons are firing in a certain way, or the chemicals are mixing in a certain way. And that accounts for what I believe and hold dear and would fight for and would die for and would take risks for and would sacrifice for my children and so forth. Do you sort of see you step back from an external point of view and explain your what you care about in that way?
I think that it makes sense to me, chemically, that we search for some form of morality, although that is extremely elusive. There's no one truth there. But I do have a strong sense of good and bad, just and unjust. And I think of those as things to fight for because, as Cornel said, everybody has their own humanity. The Palestinian baby, anybody I watch, I think of as somebody, they experience life as vividly as I do. They deserve all the chances that I do, including forbearance. I'm always saying I can't get into somebody's head. That frustrates me because I like to try to do it, whoever it is. And there are people that I just can't understand, and it frustrates me. I feel like I'm banging on a door. But to go beyond it into this rising music and this sense of, no offense, but some books written thousands of years ago by people very different from us, and the idea that a prophet who died is actually alive on some level and I'm going to live in his grace when I die, and that there's something more than this study that I'm sitting in. I guess I'm too dull or obtuse or something to quite get it, but I don't feel like that bird. I don't feel like I'm going in circles. It's a tough one.
Stay with me a second, John. Stay with me. So
I got to let you guys know I'm running out of time over here for another appointment. No.
This isn't what we're supposed to be talking about.
Go ahead, Robbie and Cornel. You can have the last word, but I'm going to have to terminate the conversation. And I do deeply regret this wonderful conversation, but I got another thing.
Thank you.
Well, just so grateful, Glenn and John. Wonderful conversation.
So, and let us continue in our endless, relentless, Socratic conversation that's moral, spiritual in some sense. That's right.
In some sense.
Somebody's going to be praying for you, John.
And I can feel it coming. Yeah.
It can be paid. Or it can be. But the important thing is that Rich wrestling with what it means to be human. And that's in many ways what the book is about.
This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you, John McWhorter. Thank you, Robbie George. And thank you, Cornel West, for your wisdom and for the gift of your intellect. I think I'm very proud of this conversation. So thanks for joining us at The Glenn Show.
Salute you.
Thank you, Glenn.